Welcome to Gospel Conversation for Sunday, September the 28th, which is the 15th Sunday in Trinity. And tonight's discussion is one of those really interesting passages, Luke 16, verses 19 to the end, which is the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And to discuss that with us now, we've got Andrew Doubleday, Methodist minister, working as a ministry educator, Gary Griffith-Smith, who is Anglican minister in the wonderful city of Gore, and Bishop Anne Van Gent from Dunedin. And I'm Kelvin Wright, and I'm also from Dunedin. And I think you've got some background for this passage for us tonight.
Yeah, I'm feeling really spoilt that I managed to get the deceitful manager last week and I get Lazarus this week. Not really the parables you would choose, but we have a lectionary and so we follow it. So I think one thing to remember or to know about this parable of Jesus's is that it's a little bit like, the jokes we tell about Peter at the pearly gates.
Yes.
It's almost a trope. So we can't go into this parable thinking, oh my goodness, we have to use this as an analysis of what the afterlife is like. That's not what it's about. And the beginning of the parable, at least, there are forms of it all over the place at the time of Jesus and before. There were Egyptian forms of it. The rabbis had at least 7 different stories followed a similar sort of theme. But it does change a bit towards the end. And so that's interesting. The idea of the person burning away happily ever here, asking for a message to be taken back. Certainly in the Egyptian stories, that's followed up. The message is taken back to people. Whereas, of course, here Jesus is saying, well, no, and even if someone rose from the dead, it's not going to make any difference. So that suddenly kind of catapults us firmly into the story of Jesus. So that that's the cultural context. There's also the context of the other parables directly before it. So once again, we've got a link with the parable of the prodigal son, where you've got a brother who wants to keep another brother homeless and in poverty. And here we've got this rich man doing the same thing to Lazarus. You've also got the fact that the weird parable about the unjust steward, the advice is to make friends among the poor with your wealth, which of course is what the rich man hasn't done. So there are all sorts of interesting parallels and links that you could follow through here. But what it kind of boils down to, I think, which we may get into later, is it seems to be mostly Jesus saying, be really careful about how you interpret scripture.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's kind of an apt warning about taking some scriptures without others, because he's talking to the Pharisees. He's talking to the Pharisees who would recognize themselves in the rich man very easily, and who thought they had biblical backing for their wealth. And this is what Jesus is challenging.
Thank you, Anne. Well, this is an interesting passage. Challenges that you might find in this passage. Gary, what do you think?
Straight up, I thought my main challenge is not to become like the wealthy man. I think it happens fairly easy without us even realizing it. And I was thinking about the fact that 3 weeks ago today, I got back from South Africa, where this parable plays out on every single street corner, at every traffic light, and where there are people who are hopelessly poor, standing in the blazing sun, desperately asking for food from motorists, or sitting in air-conditioned cars, doing their best not to make eye contact. And sadly, most of my friends would fit in that category, and they live on golf estates, and they're so isolated from the wealth. And they're not bad people, but they see this as part of their everyday landscape because they see it all the time. And so it doesn't really move them. I never saw any of them lamenting the plight of the poor whilst I was there. And so I was just for myself thinking how easy it is. And it's not a South African thing, it's a New Zealand thing as well. Mm-hmm. I see even here in Gore, we have homeless folk wandering around. We have people sleeping rough, people who are hungry coming to our church. And so the challenge is not to ever accept this as part of the landscape, to really be offended by it.
Thank you. Andrew, challenge for you in this passage.
Well, I actually got 3, so you may want to edit this. The first one was, it seems to me that Jesus is buying into an element of cultural creep with the telling of the story. Anne mentioned the way that we interpret scripture. Well, for the Hebrews, Sheol was the place of the dead, but it was a place of silence. It was a place of non-consciousness. But here we have Greek culture, which has kind of taken over, and we've got this place, Hades, where there's both the deserving and the undeserving, and they're treated very differently. And it seems to become part of the ethos of the day. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the question of Lazarus himself. He it's the only parable where one of the characters has got a name. And I found it really quite interesting that in this one, it's of a character who dies, who, and a case is made for him return to the land of the living. And Jesus says that even if someone comes back from death, it's not going to convince anybody that they're on the wrong path. And so then in John's gospel, we actually see an actual man named Lazarus who dies, the brother of Mary and Martha, and 4 days later is resuscitated by Jesus. And it's the same tribe of political leaders, religious leaders, that Jesus that tells the parable to, that once Lazarus has died, what do they want to do with him? They want to put him back to death. I mean, that's how John's gospel tells the narrative. And the third thing is the question of prosperity teaching, because it's not a thing that we have that it's for today, it's also in the first century. And it's already been alluded to that wealthy people are obviously being blessed by God. This rich man believes that he's deserving of grace. I think the shocking thing for me is that he knows Lazarus's name. He knows who he is. And even when he's in this place of torment, he still looks at Lazarus as being less than him. He still regards him as a person say, please send him here so he can put some water on my tongue. Please send him back to my brothers so they don't have to come to this stinking place. I find it really, really quite challenging.
Thank you, Andrew. Anne, challenges for you in this passage.
Yeah, so following on from Andrew's last point, I remember reading something. I always avoid comment sections, but for some reason there was an article on homelessness in Dunedin, and I did start looking for the comment section, and every single comment I read was criticizing and abusing the homeless people. So just how deeply it is embedded in our psyche that if people are suffering, they deserve it. And what it says about our need to squash our guilt or squash our sense of responsibility by turning the victims into the perpetrators. So, you know, and you know, obviously we see this on every level. We see people who are abused, the abusers turning them, trying to put the guilt onto them. But, you know, how difficult it is to fight this sense that somehow if that person is on the street, they must be responsible for it in some way. And the accompanying thing of, well, in my situation, I wouldn't do that. So it's a real challenge to fight that, because that's exactly what Jesus is saying is wrong.
So, Andrew, good news for you in this passage.
Well, the first thing is that there's ultimately justice. However you interpret the story, ultimately justice prevails. And the second thing for me is that prosperity teaching is exposed as a denial of the gospel, perpetrated by rich and powerful people to justify their privilege. It's not the way of Jesus, and it doesn't reflect the heart of God.
Thanks. Gary, good news for you in this passage.
Well, the good news for me is the fact that there were, in fact, enough resources to go around. The wealthy man had enough to feed himself all he wanted, and enough to make sure Lazarus doesn't go hungry. It's just the challenge came to distribute it. We have the resources, even in New Zealand. There's enough here to feed everybody. There's enough to house everybody, if there can be just the common will to do so. And that's our big challenge in this, to say, look, we've got the stuff. It's about hearts being changed. We don't have to go out there and suddenly create more to feed those who don't have. There's enough.
Thank you. Well, good news, a challenge there. So what does this mean for us? So what?
Do you want to ask me about good news?
Oh, yes, of course I do. I'll just get around to that. Saving the best till last. Good news, Dan.
Yeah. Well, actually, Gary, thank you, because I really struggled to find good news for me. I looked at this and thought, well, actually, it's Jesus came to bring good news for the poor, and this is good news for the poor. Just as all the way all through the Old Testament, the poor are crying out for justice, because for them, justice meant that they would be lifted up and the rich would be brought down. So I don't see a huge amount of good news for me sitting as I am in my comfortable room with food on hand, but very much good news for the poor, and that in itself is both good news and challenging.
Thank you. Well, so what, Andrew? What does this passage mean for us?
Well, the obvious one first for me is, where do I fail to see the Lazarus who's sitting right under my nose? And at the moment, I just find myself really exercised about the plight of the Palestinian people, particularly in Gaza, being dehumanized, brutalized, starved, slaughtered, where my Christian brothers and sisters are justifying a genocide because they believe that Israel is God's chosen people. And who wants to be arguing with God? I find that really quite challenging.
Gary, so what?
So what? So what is the fact that the problem is there? We can't just wish it away. It's a fact, and we have to do something about it. And so what are we going to do about it? What concrete steps can we take in our own communities to alleviate the plight of those less fortunate than ourselves? And I think there are ways. I think we can get together and make a real difference, even in one person's life.
And so what?
Yeah, well, I was hoping the others would say those, because those are the important ones. But here's a kind of sideline. How often do we have to be told something before we listen? So, all the way through the Old Testament, yes, there's the teaching about prosperity when you are obedient, but the obedience was caring for the poor to a huge extent. And we know that. We know that Jesus came to preach good news to the poor. We know how important justice is, and yet we don't do anything. So what else is blatantly clear that we refuse to face? And so my so what for the next week is going to be, when I'm reading the Bible and I hit a bit which my eyes want to glaze over because it's too challenging or it's too demanding, and therefore it can't possibly be Jesus being serious about this. When I get to that point, to stop instead and think, what if this is meant to be taken seriously, and be willing to be challenged about it.
Well, thank you all very much. That was a very enriching and challenging conversation. Andrew, Gary, Anne, thank you.